Good morning, gamers, and welcome to a pretty long ramble on the DT2 Awakened bosses, Blood Torva, and difficulty in Old School. This last bit, difficulty, is something I'm super passionate about. It's what I play the game for, it's what I most enjoy. So I'm going to be getting onto that after I run through this entire blog, and probably the majority of this video is going to be about that. So if you're interested, stick around and leave a comment. There's going to be plenty to talk about, and I think it's, again, pretty much the most interesting thing in the PVM scene is like how hard players can push the game, and as far as like the base content that gets released to us, how hard it really should be. So we're going to talk a lot about this, but for starters, let's go through this blog. It was released about 2 days ago, one day ago now, so it's not old or anything. Maybe a lot of players haven't seen it, but well, maybe there's like 1,000 videos out by now. I don't know. And the idea here is that from DT2, basically development is winding down at this point, and we're going to get 4 bosses, all solo encounters from DT2. Duke Suck Me Off, Vardovis, Leviathan, and ASMR boss. Yahoo! And these bosses are not just going to be another Vorkath. They're really going to be like a bit of a raid boss. Each of them is going to be like a raid boss. It's going to feel like that, which is really cool. A lot of people were thinking it's just another Vorkath. It's not that. It's what they're saying right now. It's not, and then they're not saying it's a Vorkath. Much more mechanically dense, more depth to the mechanics, stuff like that. So here's the thing. They're classing these variants as aspirational content, and this is like the key thing. This entire paragraph is like crazy, and I want to get back to this in depth. So let's skip that for a second and have a look at the rest of this and get back to it. Firstly, these 4 like amped up encounters, the hard mode variants, are accessible via an Awakener's Orb. This is a tradable drop. We don't know the rates of it yet, which is going to be dropped from the regular forms. This is going to be an insanely expensive thing on day 1 if it's got any high rate at all, like 1 in 150, 1 in 50, 1 in 100. But again, it could be 1 in 1. I just don't think it will be. So, firstly, I think a lot of content creators are going to want players to gift them orbs because it's going to be so expensive. I'm going to be begging on stream, so please give me your orbs if you happen to get any. And if you're watching me and want me to see someone do it like initially, then please give some to me. Thank you. Or just choose someone you want to watch and give them orbs if you happen to have a few spare, because it'll help a lot. They don't want to be spending like bills on orbs if it's crazy. If it's like 3 mil a kill, it doesn't matter. If it's like 25 mil a kill, a bit tricky, gonna cost a lot for a lot of people. But anyway, it's money is the main thing. This is an extra drop to the bosses we didn't think we'd get in the first place. So it's money, which is fantastic. If you're like just a boss farmer, you don't really care about doing this kind of stuff, or maybe you want to wait for players to do it, just sell your orbs on, or gift it to someone who wants to do it. Best way to really interact with it. That's all they're for, is just extra money. Now, this is the reward, is Blood Torva. This is a design from Mod Soften. This is a V2 variant, I think. There used to be one that had a Zaros symbol in the center, and it was red, which I think was the original design, if I'm not wrong. And I liked it a bit more, but this is like a refined version, and it's a bit like sort of old school, not old school RuneScape cool, but like old school game cool. A bit like Daedric armor from Skyrim, maybe, if you want to think a bit like that. Very like spiky, very dark. I like it personally. A lot of people, well, not too many, but a fair few people like vocally really dislike it. But I'm a fan of it, so I want it in the game. Yeah. Now, there's a poll coming out, so please vote yes, because it's probably going to pass anyway. Just like super make it happen. 100% votes yes, please. If you vote no, I'm ashamed of you, to be honest. Just give us what we want. There's no reason to vote no. If you don't like this set, then at least vote for the content, you know. And a bit below this is about Torva, about how it's a bit bulky and they want to make it a bit smaller, and a bit more in line with some of the other sets in the game. So this is like the redesign, and that's the final design, and this is the side-by-side down here. I really like Torva. I like the, I don't think the eyes are there currently, and I really like the look of the eyes behind the helmet. So I'm a big fan of this. Obviously the Darth Vader suit, yeah, I'm all for it. But let's go back now to, and again, this blog is going to be in the description if you want to read it yourself and have a look a bit more in depth. But let's go back to the difficulty aspect here and have a bit of a talk about aspirational content first. So this is a big term, and they've only thrown it around a few times. And there's a bit of a difference between aspirational content and something like hard mode Tom. And the difference is, one of them is grindable, and one of them is a one and done. What I mean by that is something like Infernal Cape. If you get an Infernal Cape, most players probably won't go get a second one. I still recommend, by the way, if you do have an Infernal Cape, try some tasks. It's really fun. A lot of players learn a lot from their first cape, and it only like improves as you do more of it, and you get like no nerves and you just like fly through the content. It's really fun. So do some tasks if you haven't done. But beyond that, GMCAs you do it once. Cursed Phalanx, which is the Fang kit from TOA, you do it once. No one really... You do 500s to farm it, but the actual act of getting the Cursed Phalanx, you only care about getting it once. And so these three things here are classed as aspirational because they are like one and done crazy grinds. And that's the idea. So whether it be a grind or like an insanely difficult fight, Cursed Phalanx isn't so much a grind as it is like one big fight, whereas Inferno is like a learning grind, and GM is obviously a grind to get there. You can maybe define it a bit how you want, but like something like hard mode Tob, because the rewards from hard mode Tob are not guaranteed, it's a little bit different to these three. I still think to a degree they're aspirational for a lot of players, but not in the same way that like players are actively striving for it and like they know they're going to get it, so they're really driving home the idea of like, I gotta do this and just get it done. But as far as what this means, aspirational content, going back to this term a lot, because they use this so rarely to describe things. What it means for something like Inferno, and I want to cast, for those of you who didn't buy your cape, or your phalanx, or your GMCAs, cast your mind back to when you got a cape if you have one. Whether it be a fire cape, everyone has a fire cape, but if you don't have a fire cape, or sorry, if you have an infernal cape, then, cast your eyes back to that first time you got your cape. That moment, that single moment of getting that cape, that final hit on Zuck, and then like the elation afterwards, and like the celebration, everything, that's what most people will quote as their favorite moment in the game. Especially if you're like a PVMer and it's what you like to do, that one moment is the thing that players often quote, the majority of players, as like their favorite thing in any game a lot of the time. It's probably one of mine, maybe like the top 5, which is still insane. But considering that, and understanding that, these things are things players work towards in a really, really big way. And they mean a lot to players when they get it as well. Nowadays, Inferno isn't too difficult, but that doesn't mean that players don't, for their first cape, feel the same way. Now, here's the bit about difficulty and what that actually means. We want that aspirational level. We want that to be like, holy shit, I did it kind of thing. And you want that elation afterwards. And you want this reward from it. But how difficult do you make it? So we're 7 minutes in. Hopefully I've got your attention. This is the bit where the fun starts. This is where the ramble begins. What constitutes difficulty in this game? To define this and have a think about it, I think the first step is to talk about the player base and talk about the high level of the player base, because they're the guys who are dealing with the difficult content first, and they're the guys who are probably going to complete it first. And if you're talking about something aspirational that players shouldn't be able to do, you should talk about the players who are currently able to do it first. So the way I like to talk about this is that the upper echelon of good players constitutes around 100 to 200 players. And what I mean by that is these players are players that are very in tune with mechanics. So tick timings, prayer switches, gear switches, movement, clicks. 5 things maybe that constitute like fundamentals of the game, where if you take any of these players and give them a similar amount of time to any of the other players in that region as far as content they want to do. Let's say Gauntlet has never been released, and you compare those 200 players to the rest of the player base, those guys are going to have an exceptionally good time compared to the other players. Now, I understand there's players always entering that level, those 1-200 players, there's always players coming up to it. But because it's such a steep curve, the amount of players that are really at that level is quite few. And there's a very distinct difference between players that are very in tune with the game and players who maybe like aren't. And a lot of this comes from pushing yourself at content. So one of the best ways to push yourself, I'm going to try and throw some examples out, is speedrunning. Speedrunning content such as Inferno, TOA, Chambers, Hard Mode Top, whatever. When you start to become a speedrunner, in particular, it sends you to a different tier of the game. Because you have to be so in tune with ticks to not lose individual ticks. A very important part of going fast in this game is being able to understand your weapon timing. And for example, if you're in the Inferno and you're trying to click an NPC with a blowpipe, if you miss 1 tick every time you attack something, and like the NPC dies instantly like a nibbler, if there's 3 nibblers, and you attack one of them each time, and you lose a tick in between, and you have a 3-tick blowpipe, your 3-tick blowpipe is 50% the DPS. It's terrible. Well, I guess it's like 75 or whatever, but 66. You get the point, right? Like it's not good. And And it matters greatly when you start losing ticks like that. So you have to be very in tune with it. It's a bit like how at Zuck, a lot of first capers, another example, sorry. A lot of first capers at Zuck are like, holy shit, my T-bow is noodling. And what they're not doing is like, their T-bow is not a 5-tick weapon at the time they're at Zuck. Their T-bow is like an 8-tick weapon. Or their prayer is not on. Or they're not potted. Stuff like that. And when you get really good at the game, when you start to speedrun, you become very in line with these mechanics, you become very in tune with the timings and the feels, and it pushes you to a bit of a different level. And again, to emphasize this and drive it home, we can use Tob as an example. For a 30-minute TOB trio time, that's not crazy at all. A 15-minute time is a much better time. A player who has a 15-minute PB compared to a 30-minute player is not twice as good. They're twice as fast, but they're not twice as good. They're like 50 times better. And if you start looking at the absolute top level players, these 200 players again, if you talk about something like Inferno, 45 minutes is a really good time. If you have a 45-minute Inferno, you are a sick speedrunner. And players have 90-minute capes. Maybe like 180. They're not just 4 times better, they're like 100 times better. And I bet they've put in nearly upwards of like 300 times as much time into learning that content and getting good at it. So there's this exponential curve of difficulty as you go up through speedrun times, and that also applies to the skill level of the player. These players are exponentially better. Now, where am I getting with this? The point is, for the aspirational content, you have to tailor it to the players of the day, the players of the current time. When Chambers was released, players weren't good. The most impressive feat was soloing Corp with potatoes or something. And nowadays we have stuff like hard mode top solo speedrunners. It's crazy, right? People who complete Inferno in 42 minutes. This is not the same level of player that we can expect from like early Chambers days. Players are insane today. And aspirational content has to challenge those players. It has to be something that really takes them out of their comfort zone and something they can't do. Now, it's again, sorry to ramble. That's the point of this, though. I'm not apologizing for this. You're here for the ramble. Players at hard mode top, when they first went in as 5-man teams when the content was released, they completed it on the very first attempt. When my team went into hard mode top, we just did it, and we were like, oh, we thought this was meant to be difficult. We thought this was meant to be hard mode, and then it was just like, we're done. Okay, but the difference is like you have to grind hard mode top, so it's about doing it repeatedly and staying consistent. Okay, fair enough. And then like all this stuff here is like things that you do once and one and done's. Therefore, it's a bit harder. Okay, fair enough. But when you're talking about stuff that's hard mode and adding like tags like this is hard mode to something, you have to understand the current level of the player base is miles beyond what it used to be. And for these 3 things in particular, yes, they took a bit of time to get to each of them, but no one in their right mind would actually consider Grandmaster combat achievements difficult. If you do, then you're not in that top player base. If you are in the top player base, you have CAs and you understand this. So it's only really cursed Phalanx. And on days 1 and 2, maybe it was difficult, but as soon as Red X Monkey came out, everyone and their nan had one of these. There were like 5 completions in first day. Cursed Phalanx was very close, but not quite Inferno tier. And then by day 3, there were like 100 players with it, because Red X was a thing. So, okay, maybe that's moving a bit beyond the idea of difficulty here. But when we're talking about challenging players, and challenging those players in particular, which was the last like 3, 4, 5 minutes, sorry, we actually have to look at how to do that. So this next bit on how to challenge those players is tricky, because there's no right answer. And I've talked extensively with a lot of people about this, including some of the devs, and one of the best sort of consensuses on this is perhaps that those 5 fundamental skills of like movement, so like pathing / movement, gear switches, prayers, all that stuff, the fundamentals of how you play the game, you can lower those windows. So at Warden P3, if you have Insanity on, it's right, left, middle on a 2-tick window. You can make that a 1-tick window. And those players at the highest level of the game currently can probably deal with that. So it's a bit tricky. Obviously, you need a window to attack, so like right, left, middle, right, left, middle, maybe, as like an example. So you have to give players a window to do stuff, but you can certainly lower the times and the reactions and the amount of gear they need to do stuff in the first place. Another example is like for the Warden core, if it was made such that you have to have all your gear on and the correct switches and DDS it perfectly with adrenaline and not lose any ticks, That's a lot harder than having like a 5-man team where you can just like stab it to death with a rapier over and over. And that's something that challenges players. But again, players, if you give them a 4-tick window to gear up and get that gear on, they'll do it. So how do you challenge these players? Because they're so good already, there's nothing you can throw at them that's actually hard. Inferno's a good example. But it's really difficult to look at wave-based minigames like that, because there's complexity that arises from all sorts of angles of NPCs and how they spawn. It's basically randomized content. You can learn the fundamentals, but it's always random. So you can add randomness to things as a way of like saying, we've got some cool spawns and now you got to deal with it. And maybe that's one way of approaching difficulty, but it's not like mechanical difficulty. If you do bring mechanical difficulty down, what's the limit? 1 tick. So like alternating on 1-tick basis in the Inferno, it's not actually that difficult. Most first capers learn to do that as well. So if you can't have like 1-tick windows for alternating prayers and gear switching, what do you do now? Combine them? Maybe you have players do a 4-way gear switch and alternate in the same tick, 5 clicks per tick. That's really difficult. But is that like difficulty that's fun is the next question. And you see where this rabbit hole goes, is like you can create all sorts of bullshit mechanics that are difficult. But are they fun to do? Do players want to engage with them? Because at a certain point, you don't. It becomes too much, it hurts your hands, and it's not interesting. So whilst we can make difficult mechanics and you can keep lowering thresholds and adding sort of stacked layers of difficulty on fundamental mechanics, at some point you have to disassociate from them and think about the bigger picture. And Inferno, again, is a good example of like wave-based difficulty, where lots of things are happening at the same time, and you have to monitor them and adjust them and then use mechanics on top of that. But I, honestly, well, this is the tricky part, right? I think, as far as old school goes, it's quite underdeveloped as an MMO goes for classic MMO mechanics. And I'd like to see more of them. Things like DPS checks are a good way to emphasize the idea of having good gear switches and prayer switches and being in the right position and doing damage effectively and not losing ticks. But then it's an RNG game. So an example at TOA is Aka. We have the shadows and a really high invocation, 500 plus. Often you'll fail a DPS check because it's RNG. You can just hit zeros. And if that happens, you take damage, but in Aka you can skip it, so it's a bit shit. But imagine for a second you can't skip it. Now that's a bit of a problem. But what if you have an example where the Aka minion always takes an average damage plus or minus 10%, i.e. a classical MMO damage? That way, as long as you're dealing optimal damage and you have the correct gear switches and everything, you should always just about manage the gear check. And if you always took damage from the effect if you failed it, that would constitute a skill difference for players to actually be able to get the gear on and start attacking correctly and not miss ticks. That's how you would force players in. And I mean, that's just one example, but to even do that, you have to firstly engage in the idea of having classical MMO damage applied. And players are like, don't do that, that's not old school. Okay, well, look at P2 Warden. How many players are complaining about P2 Warden? Not many, if any. And P2 Warden's formula takes damage and accuracy and combines them. And it gives you average damage about plus or minus 10%. So that's one of the things where it already is in the game, it is a thing. And embracing it a bit more and allowing it to be used in content is probably really wise as far as enabling things like DPS checks that aren't on an RNG basis that can constitute skill. That's one very long-winded way to develop one of these things that can even be said to be a difficulty increase to things. And the way you can increase it again is like you can add more switches to the fundamental idea of you have to DPS check this, you need more gear to do the damage in time, you have to hit the switches, reducing the window mechanically, stuff like that. And there's a few ways like that. It's so tricky though. So at this point, this is the bit where if you've been listening and you're like fed up, go down to the comments. And this isn't just like for video interaction, I'm seriously interested in this. Come up with like a mechanic or a way or an idea that constitutes actual difficulty in the way that I've done just there to display sort of like how, you know, a DPS check skill problem. And does that fit into the game? Does that feel good in the first place? Is it fun? How do you actually increase the difficulty in the game? It's just a tricky question in the first place. Now, to tie all of that back in, I know this is like some hella ramble, and maybe it's going to be completely incoherent by the time it's like at this point. Maybe you've lost me at like, I don't know, 10 minutes ago. For aspirational content, first question is, should it really be like that? Or should it just be like, fuck it, give the noobs what they want, let them have the item they want for cosmetic purposes and call it a day. Because people will complain if they don't get the item, they'll buy it maybe, whatever. Or should it be a bit like Inferno, where you're challenging the players that are currently the best in the game and making it so it's not a one and done on release, and that they actually have to put in time and like a whole day to farm and grind and improve, which is something those players haven't had to do for a long time. Should it be something that pushes those players, which is what I would personally like, and I think that, based on how I've laid it out in this, makes sense. And if you do all of those things and you do get to that point in time, how do you make that difficulty happen? How do you actually design a bit of content that is truly difficult, as opposed to just a different, what they call, flavor of encounter, flavor of mechanic? If it, like something is still movement based, if it's still movement based, it's still movement based. We can reduce the threshold, but actually like introducing a proper DPS mechanic or like a proper thresholding mechanic, whatever it is. Throw some ideas about. It's a tricky one. I know I've gone like completely roundabout through this. What it is, unlucky. But yeah, I don't know. I tried to give an example. I think it's a decent one. It's probably the best one I have right now. But it's tricky. It really is. I think, to wrap this up, finally, sorry, again. I think to wrap this up, I'd like to see smaller thresholds. I'd like to see more of that idea of DPS checks, especially. And, I don't know, for things like emergent mechanics, this is something I didn't even touch on yet. But a lot of emergent mechanics, they come by like almost purely by accident, and they're really fun to engage with. This is a bit I want to tack on because it's like almost like a revelation that I had the other day, and it was like really easy to word it out. Was that a lot of the emergent mechanics that come into the game are generally super good, but there are times where the emergent mechanic itself will end up reducing the depth of the content. And that is something we should try and seek to avoid. So a lot of the time when you have layered mechanics ongoing, and you find some like particular pathing or some particular way to deal with the boss that lets you skip a lot of that, it can add in a good amount of depth to the content. A good example is at Akka, you can butterfly to kite it. Kiting's intended, but butterfly goes on for a long time and it's quite broken. But still, like, it adds depth, right? So like the skill of the butterfly is to do it consistently and make sure it's as consistent as possible while still doing damage. Okay, that's emergent mechanic depth. And then on top of that, you could say that, but now I'm not dealing with all the things that Akka could be throwing at me. He's not like changing his styles. I don't have to deal with gear switches anymore. If you have like keep back on, God forbid, suddenly I don't have to keep back anymore because I'm just always kiting him. So you're greatly reducing the depth of some of the content with an emergent mechanic that you could use. And this is a bit of a problem because a lot of the time, emergent mechanics add a good amount of difficulty as well. And if you have something like Akka, it's like, are you truly making the game more difficult by doing this one thing that isn't actually that hard to execute? Or are you making it easier? And because these mechanics are fun to do, this question more so relies on the dev team about how they want to patch it. I use Akka a lot as an example because they changed it from butterflying the entire room. So basically at Akka, you kite it for the entire room with butterfly before the fix, and you would defeat the entire room without engaging with any mechanics. Zero. And they nerfed it to like 40. They nerfed it to a minute, so you can do it for a minute before you have to switch. And it's still a bit broken because a lot of the time you can get through the entire room with only like one middle phase. I'm still rambling. The point is, like, you got to be very careful with these things. And for the dev team especially, when it comes to balancing this out, and when these new bosses gets released, they need to be aware of if any of these things like emergent mechanics happen, or things that players can do to create this sort of increased depth mechanically, that emergent property must not take away from the actual fight itself. Because at Akka, that just like made 500s practically free alongside Red X Bubba, which is like a non-fixed version of the idea of butterflying at Akka, to relate it. And so Bubba is like a joke now. I've seen a Bubba where a dude on 1 HP, Red X is the boss for like 3 minutes without prayer, and all the sarcophagi are open. And I've seen another version where he just like prays range against the monkeys and takes like no damage. and all the sarcophagi are open. Baba doesn't hit him. It's a bit of a nightmare. At this point, you should, like, I'm just complete rambling and complaining about it, but it's shit. And they need to not let that happen, big time. So that's not really anything to do with the difficulty. That's more about like them balancing it out and being careful with it. But I don't know. Felt like saying it. Too bad. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up with that. Leave some comments down below about difficulty if you're still interested in it. I'll try and respond to some and get the discussion. Try and respond to some and get the discussion going. It's still really interesting, and it's really hard to, like, outside of jotting down a shit ton of notes and trying to like really define what makes difficulty difficult in the game. It's just very tricky. So give it a go and see what you come up with. Don't do any sort of like, well, actually, if you write a comment, think through it. Have a serious look at what you're actually saying and imagine playing through it, because that's the interesting part. If it's something that's just like, now do 8-way switches in one tick and alternate your prayers, stop. Don't post it. Just stop. Okay, that's enough shit. Probably got bored about 10 minutes in, so hopefully you got to the interesting part and tickled your brain a bit with some of the ideas, but that's about it. And yeah, see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.